Around 11:30 a.m. on August 14, 2005, two Greek military fighter pilots flew in their jets high above Athens, Greece, following behind a Boeing 737 commercial airplane. This commercial airplane was Helios Airways Flight 522. It had left Cyprus at 9 a.m. that morning with 121 people on board, and it was scheduled to have landed in Athens 45 minutes earlier. But instead, shortly after takeoff, Flight 522's pilots had stopped responding to air traffic control, and now the plane was just circling right over the city. And so at some point, the military became concerned that perhaps Flight 522 had been hijacked, and at some point, the hijackers were going to crash the plane into a city. And so in response to that, they had sent up these two fighter pilots to see what was going on. Now, when the two fighter pilots arrived on station in the air right behind Flight 522, at first, they couldn't tell what the issue was. There was no fire or visible smoke or any damage to the aircraft. And so the two fighter pilots in tandem flew up alongside the plane so they could look inside the windows. And when they did, and they saw inside to the actual fuselage, they saw all the oxygen masks were dropped down in front of the passengers, and all the passengers had the masks on. However, all the passengers were passed out. They were slumped over with these masks strapped to their faces. Now, the fighter pilots had no idea if these passengers were unconscious or dead or some combination, but for right now, all they cared about was, are the pilots conscious and able to fly this craft? And so the two fighter pilots flew up until they were parallel with the cockpit, and they looked in the window, and they saw not the pilots. They saw the oxygen mask drop down, but the pilots were not there. Instead, they saw this one guy who was clearly not a pilot. He was not in a pilot's uniform, looking out the window at them, just waving, just some random guy. And so the two fighter pilots had no idea what to make of this. Before the fighter pilots could even begin to react to whatever was going on here, this random guy in the cockpit looked out at one of the fighter pilots and just began gesturing down with his index finger, and then a moment later, Flight 522 began to descend. To fully understand what happens next, we need to go back to just before 9 a.m. on the same morning. So 9 a.m. was takeoff, and right before, the crew of Flight 522 did their routine safety checks of the aircraft, and they determined that the craft was ready for takeoff. However, they had actually missed one crucial thing. There was a knob on this aircraft that was switched to the wrong setting by a maintenance person right before takeoff, and nobody had noticed, so it wasn't put back to where it needed to be. And so Flight 522 wound up taking off on schedule, and at first, everything was fine, totally normal. But about 2 minutes into the flight, all these alarms began sounding on the aircraft, and then the oxygen mask dropped from the ceiling. And the reason for that is that knob that had been set to the wrong setting controlled how much breathable air was in the aircraft during flight. It basically had been switched to off, so there was nothing to breathe in the airplane. And so by the time these masks were dropping down, people on the plane were already passing out, including the pilots. They were passed out pretty much immediately when those masks came down. And so it's absolutely chaos in this plane. Everybody's passing out except for one person, 25-year-old flight attendant Andreas Prodromo, who, when the masks came down, he was awake, he was conscious, and instead of grabbing one of those masks from the overhead, he managed to connect himself to one of the emergency oxygen tanks. Now, the reason that's very important is the masks that drop down on an aircraft have a very limited supply of oxygen. But Andreas, who was actually training to be a pilot, was aware of that, and he put on this emergency oxygen tank, which had way more oxygen to it. And so suddenly he's breathing a much longer air source, and he's looking around the plane, and everybody's passed out except for him. Now, we don't know at what point he learned this, but at some point, Andreas would have noticed, as he's breathing on this emergency oxygen tank, that out the window he would see the plane is just flying in circles, and it would have dawned on him that not only are the passengers out, but very likely so are the pilots. And so literally there's nobody flying this plane. And so he had a decision to make. Either he was going to just sit here until the plane crashed, or he was going to do something, like try to fly the plane. And that's what he ultimately decided to do. And so Andreas stood up, he took his oxygen tank, and he headed into the cockpit, and after moving aside the unconscious pilots, he attempted to fly this plane. And so the two fighter pilots who flew up alongside the cockpit and looked in and saw that one random guy who was waving to them, that was Andreas. And unfortunately, despite the fact that Andreas was training to become a pilot, he was not remotely qualified or skilled enough to fly a big Boeing 737. He had no idea how to fly this aircraft. And making the situation even worse is very shortly after Andreas entered the cockpit, the plane ran out of fuel, and so it left its automatic holding pattern that it had been in, flying in circles, and just automatically began trying to descend. But that required pilot input to land the plane, but Andreas knew he couldn't possibly land this plane successfully. And so as the plane automatically began its descent down towards Athens, this huge city full of people, Andreas did the one thing he could do. He took one last look at one of the fighter pilots outside the window, and he gestured to them that the plane was now beginning to descend. And then Andreas, he grabbed the yoke of the aircraft and he intentionally banked it to the left, basically flying the plane away from Athens, and he guided this plane into an unpopulated hillside where it crashed. Andreas and all 120 people on that plane all died in the crash. However, because of Andreas's heroic final act of steering the plane away from Athens, not a single person on the ground was hurt.